Greetings and welcome to my review of the Green River killings, and I will be using the work by the Seattle Times journalists Tomas, Guillen, and Carlton Smith. And these journalists really put together a very comprehensive synopsis of the Green River killings. And on the PowerPoint, I have links to the actual article in the Seattle Times, and I'm going to put the link up below on this YouTube video so others that are not in the class can get the material firsthand from the Seattle Times database. Also, there's an excellent book by Tomas that was written on the Green River Killer that I've used before in some of my classes that really provided some details. The earlier version of the book came with a DVD of interviews conducted by some of the law enforcement officers and a psychologist with the Green River Killer, actually, and really, I thought, shed a lot of light on what we talk about in the course. And there's 6 parts to the articles. What went wrong? A setting made for murder. Case kept eluding police. Police net catches wrong man. A task force is born, and could killer strike again? And so I'm going to divide these into each section. At first I thought I'd try to do it all, and I thought, no, let me spend a little more time. Maybe we'll go into a little more details. But really, this all starts between it starts in 1982. And between 1982 and 1983, there were 5 women killed near the Green River in King County, Washington. And these women were young prostitutes, and by July of 1983, that the death toll had increased to 30. It was very clear that at that point that there was indeed a serial killer in the King County area. And as I mentioned, most of those that were killed were prostitutes. Some of them were teenagers as young as 15. What's important here, and we'll see later, is that prostitutes are at high risk for a variety of victimizations, including homicide, but also battery, theft, rape, and all kinds of abuses. And in this case, we'll see that there was not an adequate social service system, especially to assist the teenage runaways that had turned to prostitution to survive. And we also see that this case would not be solved for many years. So what went wrong? And that's really, we're going to look at a lot of things that went wrong, but recognizing that there's not a lot of cases to go on, but we can learn a lot about what went wrong and what went right when we analyze any case. And the Green River killings article and research and data and interviews provide us a wealth of information that we can use in addressing current cases, as well as looking back at some cases historically. But valuable time was lost. There were problems coordinating within and between the agencies, and back then there was poor record keeping, and there was the failure to follow leads, and there was lost time looking at a person who they thought might have been the murderer, so a major suspect. And while they were looking at him and observing him carefully, killings continued, and he was not the killer. And also, I think it's important to recognize the technology at the time certainly was not what we have now. When I worked in forensic mental health and child protective services back in the 80s, it was several years before I had access to a computer. And that computer, I believe, the first one I had access to, I think, was an Apple II writer, and I did my case reports on it. And I didn't even have really internet connection because the internet didn't exist, or not even modem connection. And I only had a word processing program and a dot matrix printer, and databases were created within an agency, but you couldn't really search, another agency database or have a centralized one. For example, if I wanted some information about someone, I had to call on the phone and make that request. And the person may get back with me in a day or two. And so technology, and crime mapping. One of my colleagues did crime mapping, and he actually had a map of the region, and he put different pins with different colors on the pinheads to indicate what type of victimization occurred. Was it child neglect, sexual abuse, physical abuse, and so on. So actually a map with the little push pins. Some of you are wondering, what in the world am I talking about? And others of you who might be more in the age range that I'm in, remember that real well. But things have changed dramatically. So I think that's important to remember as well. The forensic investigatory techniques had changed. Surveillance had changed. I mean, a lot has changed since that time. So I think that's important to put that in that context. And certainly you had very dedicated police officers working very hard, but also, I would surmise, becoming extremely frustrated by not being able to catch this killer who kept on killing. What went wrong? Ignored possibilities. That the police focused their attention on the first 5 murders and tended to ignore that the murders could still be going on. And then in 1984, the Green River Task Force formed, and it appeared that the murders had stopped. And of course, when murders stop, people wonder, well, is that a cooling off period? Or did the perpetrator move and is murdering in other states or areas? Or did the perpetrator get arrested and is in jail? Or did the perpetrator die? Or, we wonder what happened. And we'll see in this case. And also the authors point out that the police ignored runaway cases. And so there's a lot of problems with missing persons. And if you think about it, runaways, missing persons, prostitutes are all at very high risk, and are basically targets for those that want to engage in violent behavior toward these women. What went wrong? A burden unit. For example, the vice unit was understaffed and was doing administrative work, and it was over a year and a half before they really became connected to the homicide detectives. And the unit also spent time doing inspections and collecting fees. In other words, they were doing a bunch of busy work, getting a little revenue for the county, but not really being allowed to do what they could have been doing as far as investigatory work. And the authors point out that there's a high probability that the police may have actually, seen the killer or passed by the killer at some points. The killer was among everyone in that sense. And that's not uncommon, we'll see, in some of the cases that we study, that the killer lives what appears to be a relatively ordinary life to the general observer. And sometimes even family members don't have any idea what is going on. Too many details. That, again, we have to remember the technology wasn't available that we have today, but the police did not look at the Johns, and the Johns are those that purchase sex from the prostitutes, and they didn't look at their license plates because they simply didn't have the time or computing power to do all that at that particular juncture. Also, what went wrong? Investigation gaps. So there was a focus, for example, on massage parlors, and that wasted valuable time looking for the killer, because the killer didn't kill in massage parlors or massage parlor workers or masseuses or whatever, but killed prostitutes that were picked up in a particular area. And also, time was taken away because some of the law enforcement officers were tasked with focusing on illegal gambling and, as I mentioned before, other administrative type tasks. But they did get a new computer system, and of course, anytime you get new technology, that can be a help, but it can also be a hindrance when one's trying to get that running and learning how it operates and all that. And also at that time, the agency, according to the authors, had low morale due to the bad public perceptions and the number of killings that had occurred, and not getting the killer. In other words, this was perceived as a failure in terms of how the case was going. Also, they found some suspects who turned out to be wrong leads, the wrong men basically, and that led to lawsuits and negative publicity. And I've seen that happen before in other cases. And also that juveniles were treated like adults and also lacked social services, and so that put them at higher risk as well. And again, sometimes very useful information may be obtained from those who are working in prostitution or from runaways, but they may be less likely to talk to someone if they think they're going to get arrested or get in trouble or end up in a locked unit or sent back to an abusive home or something of that sort. So having the social service system in place might have opened up some options to hear more about that. And also, in terms of what went wrong, a growing pool. That the killer had a large pool of potential victims and was also able to elude police. And even when they cracked down on prostitutes in one area, the prostitutes moved to another area. Displacement occurred. And of course, what we can see there is, that we still have, the problems that we have to deal with. And then eventually what happened is the police moved away from arresting the prostitutes to instead arresting the Johns. And so you can see what can go wrong in any investigation. And I've seen other cases where you see these similar patterns and themes emerge. And again, I think it's real important not to be hypercritical of the department and the investigators, but to learn what might have made things go smoother, or what might have helped the investigators, or how they might have sped up the investigation, or how they may have gathered more data to lead to the serial killer. And I'm a very strong advocate of learning from mistakes. Certainly I've made mistakes in my career, and I've tried to learn from those mistakes. When we hide the mistakes, or where we just focus on, well, that was bad, but we don't learn from that, the problems persist. In healthcare, we have the medical errors era, where there's encouragement at hospitals and other healthcare agencies to report when medical errors are made rather than try to hide it. So they can figure out where things went wrong and how to prevent those in the future. And I think that is a useful model to think about in investigating, serial murders. In other words, this Green River killer case is fascinating from a psychological point of view, in looking at who the killer actually turned out to be, and some of the discussions and information the professionals had with him, but also looking at the investigation process, what can be used, thinking about different methods that that we use today that are different. Certainly, crime mapping is very much more sophisticated today than it was back then. So that's kind of a summary of part one, and I have the link for you. And as I mentioned, Guillen and Smith just did a wonderful job summarizing a lot of the details and a lot of information about the case, and so you can read that as well. And I also wanted to put together a little presentation, and I will continue around weekly intervals to do the other 5 parts as we progress in the semester. And so again, take a look and think about, what you would do in that situation, and some of the things that you could do to prevent problems, and sometimes what happens when problems are out of our control or out of our hands. And we see that in policy courses where that we have data and research shows certain policy is probably going to lead to problems or not, and if the investigators or the agencies, organizations don't get the support that they need, then we can expect particular result. And this wraps up this video.